Before the world was set ablaze in 1939, the German army was already shaping the weapons it would take to war. And one of those weapons would become the most lethal tank killer of the Second World War, even though it was never meant to fight tanks at all. But why did the deadliest tank killer in history suffer the greatest casualty rate in Germany's attempt to conquer entire Europe? For the Allies, it was a nightmare. For the men inside, it was survival or death. This is how a humble assault gun became the deadliest tank destroyer of World War II. This is the story of StuG 3. The First World War had taught armies a brutal truth. When the attack outruns its artillery, the advance grinds to a halt. The heavy-towed cannons that broke trench lines in 1918 were devastating when in position, but slow, cumbersome, and entirely unsuited for the kind of fast-moving war German planners envisioned for the future. By the mid-1930s, German military doctrine was shifting toward Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare. It was a philosophy built on speed, coordination, and striking deep into enemy territory before they could respond. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft would work together in a single, fluid offensive. But the problem still lingered. How do you give infantry the firepower to destroy hardened defenses without forcing them to wait for towed guns to be hauled into place? How can we build a weapon of destruction without sacrificing our pace? The answer would be a new type of vehicle. Not a tank, but an assault gun. The requirements issued to designers in 1936 were clear and unforgiving. The vehicle must be low enough to avoid easy detection, ideally no taller than a standing soldier. It must mount a short-barreled 75mm gun, optimized for firing high-explosive shells. It would not need a rotating turret. Instead, the gun would be fixed in a forward-facing armored casement. Armor should be thick enough to withstand small arms fire and light anti-tank weapons from the front. For the chassis, engineers turned to a proven platform, the Panzer III medium tank. It was reliable, mechanically sound, and already in production. The turret was removed, replaced with a boxy armored superstructure. Inside, a four-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, would work in tight quarters. One unusual decision: the new vehicle, named Sturmgeschütz, or assault gun, would be placed under the artillery branch, not the armored corps. This was no accident. The men who would operate the StuG were not tankers by training. They were artillerymen, with expertise in precision gunnery, range estimation, and target engagement. By May 1940, just 30 StuGs had been built, enough to equip a handful of batteries. These would see combat for the first time during the Battle of France. The StuG's mission here was exactly what it had been designed for: advancing alongside infantry, smashing fortified machine gun nests, silencing enemy artillery positions, and blowing apart concrete bunkers. Crews quickly learned to use the vehicle's low profile to their advantage. At just under 2 meters in height, it could be hidden behind hedgerows, walls, or small rises in the terrain. Enemy gunners often didn't see a StuG until it opened fire. By then, it was too late. Call it the element of surprise. Its short-barreled 75mm StuK 37L/24 gun fired a heavy, low-velocity shell ideal for high-explosive impact. Against fortifications, the effect was devastating. One well-placed round could neutralize a bunker that would have taken infantry hours to capture. But there was a weakness. When faced with enemy tanks, the StuG was almost helpless. Its howitzer could damage lightly armored vehicles, but against heavier British or French designs, it lacked penetration power. In 1940, this wasn't a crisis. That was the job of the Panzer divisions. The StuG was never meant to duel enemy armor. The campaign in France confirmed two things for German commanders. The concept worked brilliantly in its intended role. Its concealment and defensive potential were even better than expected. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German and Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union, launching the largest land invasion in history. The StuG went forward once again as an infantry support weapon, providing close-range fire to smash Soviet strongpoints. At first, it worked as before. Soviet defenses crumbled under combined arms assaults. Villages, trenches, and bunkers fell quickly when faced with coordinated attacks from infantry, tanks, aircraft, and StuGs firing high-explosive shells at point-blank range. Then, the shock came. From the morning mist, German troops began encountering two new machines, the T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank. Both were unlike anything they had faced before. The T-34 combined thick, sloped armor with a powerful 76.2mm gun and remarkable mobility. The KV-1 was even more heavily armored, nearly impervious to most German weapons of the time. The StuG's short-barreled gun could barely scratch them, even at close range. German infantry's standard anti-tank weapons fared little better. The sheer number of these Soviet tanks was alarming, and this was only the beginning. Although poor Soviet coordination and tactics blunted the immediate threat, German high command knew they needed a response fast. They knew that this time they were outgunned. That response would come in the form of a major redesign of the StuG. The original infantry support howitzer would be replaced with a long-barreled 75mm high-velocity gun, specifically a modified version of the PaK-40 anti-tank gun, adapted to fit the StuG's casemate. Externally, the changes were subtle: a longer gun tube, a muzzle brake to control recoil, and spaced armor plates bolted to the front to resist enemy shells. But on the inside, it was a different beast. New optics gave gunners incredible accuracy, while ammunition storage increased to 54 rounds. Each round could be armor-piercing or high-explosive, depending on the mission. This change would transform the vehicle's role entirely. No longer just an assault gun, it would become a dedicated tank destroyer. Fast to produce, deadly in ambush, and capable of holding ground against the Soviet armor tide. By late 1942, these new StuGs began arriving at the front. They had the firepower to punch through T-34s at combat ranges, the same low profile that made them hard to spot, and the precision of crews trained as expert gunners. From this point on, the StuG was no longer just another support vehicle. It was about to become the most effective armored killer of the entire war. The StuG's lack of a rotating turret was often seen as a disadvantage. In reality, it forced crews to fight differently, to use concealment, positioning, and coordination to devastating effect. On the flat steppes of Ukraine or in the dense forests around Smolensk, StuG units set up kill zones. Camouflaged in tree lines or behind low rises, they waited until Soviet tanks moved into range. Once the lead enemy vehicle was hit, the rest of the column often stalled, giving the StuGs time to pick them off one by one. Survivors recall the methodical rhythm, the commander's calm voice, the loader's hands moving in a blur, the gunner adjusting his sights, and then the sharp blast, the recoil, and the satisfying sight of an enemy tank erupting in flame. By 1943, the StuG-3 had quietly surpassed the Panzer IV in production. It was faster and cheaper to build, requiring less steel and fewer complex parts than turreted tanks. In fact, at peak production, Germany was turning out more than 300 StuGs a month, an industrial miracle given the Allied bombing campaign. And the results spoke for themselves. In 1943 alone, StuGs were credited with destroying over 20,000 Soviet tanks. In many divisions, they achieved kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better in defensive operations. By war's end, StuGs accounted for more confirmed tank kills than any other German armored vehicle. Initially, StuGs supported infantry advances, firing high-explosive shells into fortified positions before rolling forward to engage enemy armor. But as Germany's situation worsened after the defeat at Stalingrad and the massive losses at Kursk, the StuG's role shifted almost entirely to defensive warfare. Crews learned to fight delaying actions, ambush, fire, and then rapidly reposition before Soviet artillery could zero in. The low silhouette meant StuGs were often unseen until it was too late. Many Soviet veterans later admitted that spotting a StuG was almost impossible until the first shot was fired. A StuG crew was a tight-knit group: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Sometimes a fifth man, the radio operator, was squeezed into the compartment. Each relied completely on the others. There was no room for mistakes. In memoirs, German veterans described the mental strain: hours of waiting in freezing cold, knowing that at any moment they could be spotted by Soviet scouts or strafed by low-flying IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft. When the battle started, adrenaline took over, reloading in seconds, spotting the next target, listening for the dreaded whistle of incoming artillery. The StuG could destroy, but it could also be destroyed. One lucky hit from a Soviet 76mm gun, or worse, a point-blank shot from a T-34, could turn the steel coffin into a furnace. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, and the proving ground for the StuG's capabilities. While Tigers and Panthers stole the headlines, StuGs quietly did much of the heavy lifting. In the southern sector, StuG brigades accounted for dozens of Soviet tank kills each day, often halting entire offensives with just a few well-placed shots. Kursk also revealed the limits of the vehicle. Without a turret, once flanked, a StuG was in serious trouble. Soviet tankers learned to send fast T-70 light tanks around the sides while heavier T-34s absorbed the frontline fire. For the first time, StuG crews began welding spare track links to the sides of their vehicles for extra protection. By late 1943, the StuG had become the most common armored vehicle in the Wehrmacht. Its success led to specialized units, Sturmgeschützabteilungen, that were deployed wherever the front was under threat. These units often arrived just in time to repel Soviet breakthroughs, buying precious hours or days for infantry to regroup. But this also meant the StuG was being used in situations far beyond its intended role, sometimes thrown into desperate counterattacks or urban fighting where its fixed gun was a serious handicap. Still, in skilled hands, it remained deadly. Despite its reputation, the StuG could not change the course of the war. Soviet industry was producing thousands of tanks per month, and the Red Army was learning from every defeat. New designs, like the T-34/85, could better withstand the StuG's fire, forcing German engineers to constantly upgrade ammunition and optics. Air superiority also began to work against the StuG. Allied fighter bombers, especially the Soviet IL-2 and later the American P-47 in the West, made daylight movement dangerous. The low profile helped, but open terrain was still a death trap. By 1944, the tide of the Second World War had turned decisively against Germany. The battles that once allowed the Sturmgeschütz to dictate the pace, ambushes on open fields, coordinated assaults with infantry, were replaced by desperate defensive stands. The Soviet Red Army was pressing westward with overwhelming numbers. In the west, the Allies had landed in France. German armored formations were stretched thin, and what had once been a specialized assault gun now found itself thrown into roles it was never meant to fill. The StuG-3 and its larger cousin, the StuG-4, were increasingly tasked with fighting in chaotic, fluid situations, often without proper infantry support. In these moments, the strengths of the vehicle could be undermined. The low silhouette was still an advantage in ambushes, but in urban or forested environments, where enemies could approach from multiple angles, the fixed gun became a limitation. Turreted Allied tanks could pivot their guns rapidly. A StuG crew had to turn the entire vehicle to track a moving target, precious seconds that could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Even at its thickest, the frontal plate was only 80 millimeters, enough in 1942, but by 1944, Soviet 85mm shells from the T-34/85 could punch through it from over a kilometer away. Heavy Soviet tanks like the IS-2, with their massive 122mm guns, could destroy a StuG with a single hit, often shattering both armor and crew in one violent blast. Flanking was even deadlier. Its thin side and rear plates, barely 30mm, turned any penetration into a death sentence. The vehicle's mobility also began to betray it. Built on the aging Panzer III chassis, the StuG-3 relied on a 300-horsepower Maybach HL-120 engine, a power plant never intended for the heavier loads of late-war armor upgrades. As weight increased, speed and agility suffered. On the muddy, frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front, it was increasingly common for StuGs to bog down or break down entirely, leaving them as stationary targets for advancing Soviet armor. Even its once formidable gun was falling behind. The 75mm StuK-40L/48 remained accurate and deadly at medium range, But by 1944, it struggled against the thicker frontal armor of upgraded enemy tanks. T-34/85s and IS series heavies could shrug off hits that would have been fatal 2 years earlier, forcing StuG crews to aim for side shots or wait in ambush, tactics that grew harder to execute as Germany shifted to defensive warfare. Still, on paper, the StuG's kill record remained impressive. Veteran crews who had survived since the early days of the Eastern Front were devastatingly effective. But those veterans were a dying breed. The brutal attrition of the war meant many StuGs were now crewed by hastily trained replacements. Men who had only weeks, sometimes days, of gunnery and tactical instruction before being sent into battle. Production numbers actually increased during this period. In 1944 alone, over 7,700 StuGs were built, making it the single most produced German armored fighting vehicle of the war. The decision was partly economic. The StuG was cheaper and faster to manufacture than a Panzer IV or Panther, requiring less steel, fewer man-hours, and using the Panzer III chassis, which was already in large-scale production. In a war economy under constant Allied bombing, this mattered. However, quantity could not overcome the shifting battlefield realities. In the summer of 1944, during Operation Bagration, the Soviets launched one of the largest offensives in military history. Entire German army groups were smashed apart, and hundreds of StuGs were lost in a matter of weeks. Many were abandoned, out of fuel or mechanically disabled, rather than destroyed in direct combat. In the West, the Allied breakout from Normandy saw similar scenes. StuGs fighting in close quarters, often falling victim to fighter bombers, artillery, and infantry armed with PIATs and bazookas. The casualty rate for StuG crews skyrocketed. While the armor on the frontal glacis could still deflect many medium-caliber rounds, the thinner side armor, often only 30 millimeters thick, was vulnerable. A hit to the side could ignite the fuel or ammunition, killing the crew instantly. Survivors spoke of the cramped interior becoming an inferno within seconds. The loader, seated on the left, was particularly exposed to spalling, fragments of armor blown off inside the hull by enemy hits. By late 1944 and into 1945, the StuG's missions became increasingly suicidal. In Hungary, at the battles around Lake Balaton, German assault gun brigades faced wave after wave of Soviet armor, supported by artillery and air power. In Berlin, they fought among the ruins, firing down streets at Soviet tanks only to be outflanked moments later. For many crews, the war's final months were a grim countdown. Survival was measured not in months, but in days. Despite these conditions, the StuG remained feared. In skilled hands, it could still ambush and destroy heavy Soviet IS-2 tanks. Allied reports from 1945 describe entire platoons of Shermans being knocked out by well-camouflaged StuGs hidden in forests or rubble. Yet these victories were isolated, unable to change the course of the war. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, over 10,000 StuGs of all variants had been produced. Estimates suggest that they were responsible for the destruction of more enemy tanks than any other German armored vehicle. Some historians place the figure as high as 20,000 to 30,000 kills. Their cost-effectiveness was unmatched. They were simpler to build than a Panther, more mechanically reliable than a Tiger, and in defensive warfare often more lethal. After the war, surviving StuGs saw brief service in the armies of nations like Finland and Syria. Many were scrapped, their steel recycled in the reconstruction of Europe. A few were preserved, now sitting in museums as relics of a war that pushed engineering and human endurance to their limits. The StuG's legacy is complex. It began as an infantry support weapon, evolved into one of the deadliest tank destroyers of the conflict, and ended the war as a symbol of Germany's desperate, resource-stretched defense. For its crews, it was both a deadly tool and a steel coffin. For historians, it remains a case study in adaptation, how a weapon designed for one purpose can be transformed entirely by the realities of war. And perhaps that is the final story of the StuG, a machine shaped not just by its engineers, but by the battlefield itself. It outlasted the mighty Tigers, outproduced the Panthers, and carved a place in history not through invincibility, but through relentless utilitarian efficiency, even in the face of certain defeat.